the dam never broke. That is what makes this story so terrifying. At 10:39 p.m. on October 9th, 1963, the lights were still burning in the Italian town of Longarone. Families were finishing dinner. Workers were still inside factories. Cars were moving through the valley. Most people had received no order to leave. More than 260 meters above them stood the Vajont Dam, one of the tallest dams on Earth and a masterpiece of modern engineering. The concrete wall was not collapsing. The danger was behind it. On the side of the reservoir, an entire section of Monte Toc had begun to move. Not a few falling rocks, not a normal landslide. A massive mountain containing roughly 266 million cubic meters of rock, earth, and forest broke free and accelerated toward the lake. It was nearly 2 kilometers wide, and it entered the reservoir in about 20 seconds. The impact forced the lake upward. One wave climbed hundreds of meters across the opposite mountainside. Another turned toward the dam. The water rose above the concrete crest and poured over it in a colossal dark wall. Around 50 million cubic meters fell into the gorge below. The dam remained standing. But Longarone had no protection from what came next. Before the water reached the town, a violent blast of air shattered windows and tore into buildings. Then the wave descended from above. Homes disappeared, factories vanished. Bridges, roads, churches, and entire neighborhoods were stripped from the valley. 4 minutes after the mountain began to move, much of Longarone no longer existed. The official death toll was 1,917. Around 400 victims were never found. But this was not an unpredictable act of nature. The mountain had been warning them for years. A crack nearly 2 kilometers long had opened across Monte Toc. A smaller landslide had already fallen into the reservoir. Roads were deforming. Trees were leaning. Residents felt tremors and heard deep rumbling from inside the mountain. Monitoring instruments showed the slope accelerating. Engineers knew that an enormous mass of rock was unstable. When the mountain moved faster, they lowered the water. When it slowed, they raised the water again. They began treating an entire mountain like a machine they could control. On the final day, the slope was moving faster than ever. The mountain road had already become impassable. Urgent telephone calls were being made. Barriers were placed near the reservoir. But the town directly below the dam was not evacuated. This is not the story of a concrete wall that failed. The wall performed almost exactly as it had been designed to perform. This is the story of a system that saw the warnings, measured the danger, calculated the possible wave, and continued operating until there was no time left. A brilliant dam survived. An entire town did not. This is the true story of Vajont. And to understand how nearly 2,000 people were left beneath a mountain that everyone already knew was moving, we have to return to the valley before the reservoir existed. The Vajont River once flowed through a deep and narrow valley in the Dolomites, near the border of the Veneto and Friuli regions. Above the gorge stood the villages of Erto and Casso. Below it, where the Vajont met the Piave River, lay Longarone, and smaller communities including Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, Fai, and Codisago. Longarone was not an isolated collection of stone houses. By the early 1960s, it was a growing town connected to roads, factories, shops, schools, churches, and the wider economy of northern Italy. Families lived close to the river and beneath the surrounding mountains. Workers traveled through the valley, children attended school, cafes and businesses opened along the streets. The landscape was steep and dramatic, but it was also familiar. Generations had learned where rivers rose, where snow collected, and where rock falls could occur. The new dam changed the scale of everything. Instead of a narrow river, the valley above Longarone would hold an artificial lake. The enormous wall would store water gathered from a wider hydroelectric system and direct energy toward the Soverzine power plant. For post-war Italy, hydroelectricity represented modernization. Electricity meant industry, transportation, household appliances, and economic growth. Mountain valleys became strategic resources. Rivers could be redirected, water could be stored, height could be converted into power. The Vajont Gorge seemed almost perfect for an arch dam. Its walls were narrow, steep, and apparently strong. A curved concrete structure could transfer the pressure of the reservoir into the rock on both sides. But a dam is never only a wall. It is also the water behind the wall, the geology beneath it, and the mountains surrounding it. The concrete at Vajont would prove extraordinarily strong. The mountain beside the reservoir would prove far more dangerous. Plans for a dam in the Vajont Valley existed long before construction began. The project grew larger over time, eventually becoming one of the most ambitious hydroelectric works in Europe. Excavation began during the 1950s. By 1959, the great double-curved arch dam was essentially complete. It rose more than 260 meters above the valley floor. At the crest, the wall was only a few meters thick. Near the base, it widened to carry immense loads into the sides of the gorge. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete were used. Roads were built. Tunnels were cut through the mountains. Homes and land were expropriated. A new route was planned around the future reservoir. The scale of the project created confidence. To the public, the dam looked almost impossible to defeat. It stood between vertical cliffs like a smooth concrete blade. Its shape seemed precise, modern, and permanent. But there had been questions about the slopes. The left side of the reservoir was formed by Monte Toc. The name later became associated with the disaster, but the danger was not obvious to everyone at first. The mountain was covered by forest, rock layers, old deposits, and complicated geological structures. Some geological assessments described strong rock around the dam site itself. That was important for the foundation of the concrete wall. But the stability of the dam abutments was not the same question as the stability of the entire reservoir slope. The dam could be securely anchored and still face disaster from a mountain several kilometers wide. As construction continued, experts disagreed over what they were seeing. Some believed movements would remain shallow or limited. Others suspected that a much larger ancient landslide body existed inside Monte Toc. If the mountain had already collapsed in prehistoric time, then filling the reservoir could reactivate an old failure surface hidden beneath the slope. Water could enter fractures. Pressure could rise inside the rock. Weak clay layers could lose strength, and the lake could remove or change support near the base of the mountain. The danger was not that the dam would be poorly built. The danger was that the reservoir might wake a sleeping landslide. The mountain starts to move. Experimental filling began in 1960. As the water level rose, changes appeared on Monte Toc. In March, a landslide occurred near the lower slope. Monitoring points were installed to measure movement. Then a geological investigation reached a disturbing possibility. The unstable mass might be enormous. If the sliding surface tilted toward the reservoir, the presence of water could reactivate it, with consequences that were difficult to predict. That warning did not stop the project. During the autumn of 1960, an enormous M-shaped crack opened across the mountain. It extended for roughly 2 kilometers and traced part of the boundary of the future disaster. On November 4th, about 700,000 cubic meters of material broke away and fell into the reservoir. Compared with what would happen 3 years later, this was small. But it was large enough to prove that the slope was active. After the slide, the reservoir level was lowered. Engineers and geologists gathered at the site. The possibility of a much larger collapse could no longer be dismissed. One response was to build a bypass tunnel through the mountain. If a huge landslide divided the reservoir in two, the tunnel could keep water moving between the separated sections. The tunnel was an extraordinary engineering measure. It was also an admission. The project was preparing for the possibility that Monte Toc could enter the lake on a massive scale. The central question became not whether the mountain might slide, but how it would slide. Would it break apart slowly? Would it fall in separate sections? Would it move as one compact body? How fast could it travel? And how large a wave could it create? These questions were studied with surveys, instruments, geological observations, and physical models. A scaled reservoir was built to test the effect of landslides entering the water. The experiments produced a proposed safety threshold for the lake level, but every model depended on assumptions. The size of the moving mass, the speed of entry, the shape of the slide, and the behavior of the water. A slower landslide might create a manageable wave. A fragmented landslide might displace water in stages. A single compact mass moving at extreme speed would be far more destructive. The mountain did not clearly reveal which version would occur. Meanwhile, the reservoir continued to be filled and lowered. Each rise in water was followed by acceleration of the slope. Each drawdown was followed by some slowing. This pattern encouraged a dangerous idea. Perhaps the landslide could be controlled by controlling the lake. The movement appeared to respond to operations. When the mountain accelerated, lower the water. When it slowed, raise the water again. But slowing was not the same as becoming stable. The mountain was not being repaired. Its internal strength was not returning. The slide surface remained inside it, and every cycle changed the pressure within the slope. The operators had discovered an influence. They had not gained control. People living near the reservoir did not need instruments to know that something was wrong. They saw cracks. They felt tremors. They heard rumbling from the mountain. They watched roads deform and trees lean. Water in the reservoir sometimes became muddy. The journalist Tina Merlin wrote about fear in the valley and the risks surrounding the project. The company responded by accusing her of spreading false information and causing alarm. In 1960, she was taken to court. She was acquitted. The court found that her reporting was not false or exaggerated, but the project continued. The conflict surrounding Vajont was not simply a debate between science and superstition. Some of the most serious warnings came from engineers, geologists, local officials, monitoring instruments, and the mountain itself. The problem was how those warnings were interpreted, communicated, and acted upon. Reports did not always reach outside authorities. Experts disagreed. Dangerous findings were balanced against reassuring ones. Uncertainty was repeatedly treated as a reason to continue testing rather than a reason to stop. The company behind the project, SADE, held enormous technical and political influence. The hydroelectric system was economically valuable, and the dam had become a symbol of professional achievement. By the early 1960s, the reservoir was not merely a construction site. It was part of an operating energy network, and the Italian electricity industry was moving toward nationalization. Responsibility became divided among private engineers, state authorities, testing commissions, civil engineering offices, local governments, and eventually, ENEL. A project shared between many institutions can appear heavily supervised. It can also create gaps in responsibility. Everyone may know part of the danger while no one takes the final decision to eliminate it. In 1961 and 1962, filling continued under changing authorizations and limits. Tests suggested that a lake level near 700 meters above sea level might reduce the danger of a wave overtopping the dam, depending on the assumed landslide. But in 1963, authorization was granted to raise the reservoir higher, towards 715 meters. The third filling began in April. As the lake approached its highest levels, the mountain responded. By September, instruments recorded a continuous increase in movement. The reservoir was held near 710 meters before the final drawdown began. The movement did not stop. It accelerated. Measurements rose from millimeters per day to centimeters per day. By October 9th, some points were moving by roughly 20 centimeters per day. The mountain was no longer quietly adjusting. It was approaching collapse. Local officials had already written about constant anxiety, muddy water, rumbling, tremors, and fears for the population. On the final day, danger was visible. But the system still operated as if there were time. The last day. Wednesday, October 9th, 1963, began with the mountain already moving rapidly. The reservoir was being lowered. Engineers hoped the drawdown would slow the slope, as it had before. But the response was no longer fast enough. The mountainside cracked and shifted. Trees tilted. Sections of road became distorted. By the evening, trucks could no longer pass along the route on the left bank. At 5 p.m., instructions were given to request a roadblock in the dangerous area. At 5:50, one of the leading engineers spoke by telephone with a consultant and was urged to remain calm. The drawdown continued. At 8 p.m., the road toward Monte Toc was blocked. There were discussions about closing the main state road north and south of Longarone. These actions show that officials expected something to happen, but they did not expect what actually happened. The danger was framed mainly around roads near the reservoir and settlements higher on the slopes. Longarone below the dam was not fully evacuated. The dam itself was still trusted, and that trust shaped the way the threat was understood. If the concrete wall remained intact, many assumed the town below would remain protected. Shortly before 10 p.m., the engineer stationed near the reservoir called Venice. He reported that the mountain had visibly begun to yield. A telephone operator listening to one account Asked whether Longarone was in danger, she was reassured. There are different versions of the final calls, but the basic reality is clear. The mountain was moving, officials were communicating, and the town below did not receive an effective warning in time. Across Longarone, people continued their evening. Lights remained on in houses, businesses, and industrial buildings. Some residents knew there were problems at the reservoir. Others had lived with warnings and tremors for so long that another alert might not have felt final. The mountain had moved before. The water had been lowered before. The engineers had managed it before. But by that night, the system was no longer managing the mountain. It was only watching the final stage. At 10:39 p.m., the failure surface released. Monte Toc did not fall in small pieces. It moved as one enormous body. The mountain enters the lake. About 266 million cubic meters of rock detached from Monte Toc. The moving mass was roughly 2 kilometers wide. Forest, earth, and layered limestone traveled together toward the reservoir. The collapse took around 20 seconds. Some estimates place the speed near 100 kilometers per hour. At that speed, there was no gradual entry into the water. The mountain struck the reservoir like a solid object. The lake had almost nowhere to go. The Vajont Valley was narrow, with steep walls on both sides. The landslide filled a large part of the reservoir and forced the water upward and outward. One wave traveled upstream toward communities on the shores. Water climbed high along the opposite slope, destroying buildings and killing people in villages around the lake. The other wave moved toward the dam. It rose above the crest. The wall itself remained stable, but the water crossed it in a vast, dark mass. Around 50 million cubic meters fell into the gorge below. The drop transformed potential energy into violence. Water, air, mud, rock, trees, and debris accelerated toward the Piave Valley. People in Longarone did not see a normal flood approaching along a river. The wave descended from above and exploded into the valley. The force created a blast of air before the water arrived. Windows shattered. Structures were struck by pressure, then by the flood itself. In moments, Longarone was overwhelmed. Buildings were torn from foundations. Streets were erased. Bridges, factories, homes, and churches disappeared beneath water and debris. Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, Faye, Codisago, and other communities were struck. Some locations were destroyed almost completely. The destruction did not resemble the aftermath of a river slowly rising. It resembled a landscape scraped clean. The wave carried bodies and debris into the Piave River. The flood continued through the valley, spreading material far downstream. Some remains were recovered many kilometers away. Others were never found. The official death toll reached 1,917. Around 400 victims remain missing. Entire families disappeared. In some households, no one survived to report who had been inside. The number of injured was surprisingly small compared with the number killed, because the wave left so little opportunity for partial escape. People were either outside the central path, protected by elevation or chance, or caught by a force that destroyed almost everything around them. And above the ruined valley, the dam still stood. There was some damage near the top, but the great concrete arch had resisted the event. This created the central image of Vajont, an engineering masterpiece standing over a dead town. The structure had performed, the system had failed. The disaster lasted only minutes. The decisions that made it possible had taken years. When daylight reached the Piave Valley, rescuers found a landscape that was difficult to understand. The familiar town plan had disappeared. Roads ended in debris. Buildings that should have marked intersections were gone. Mud, broken timber, twisted metal, stones, clothing, and fragments of homes covered the valley floor. Firefighters, soldiers, police, medical workers, volunteers, and survivors began searching. But rescue quickly became recovery. There were very few trapped survivors to reach. Many bodies could not be identified. Some were buried without names. Others were carried far downstream. The flood eventually reached the Adriatic Sea, scattering evidence of the disaster along its route. Above the dam, the landslide had reshaped the reservoir. The great body of Monte Toc now filled the valley, dividing and displacing the water. The mountain that engineers had monitored for years was no longer a slope. It had become a new landscape. News of the catastrophe spread across Italy and the world. At first, the disaster could be described as an extraordinary natural event, a giant landslide, a wave, and a destroyed town. But survivors and investigators knew that the story did not begin at 10:39 p.m. Documents existed, measurements existed, letters existed, warnings existed. The mountain's acceleration had been recorded. The bypass tunnel demonstrated that a major slide had been anticipated. Model tests demonstrated that destructive waves had been considered. The final road closures demonstrated that immediate danger had been recognized. The question was no longer whether anyone could have imagined a landslide. The question was why the population below had not been protected from a danger that was already being discussed. A commission of inquiry was created shortly after the disaster. Investigators collected an enormous body of evidence: technical reports, maps, letters, photographs, seismic records, geological samples, models, and testimony. The legal proceedings would continue for years. The case was moved far from the disaster area to L'Aquila, hundreds of kilometers away. For survivors and relatives, justice became another long journey. The first trial ended in 1969. Initial convictions focused largely on the failure to warn and evacuate, while the predictability of the landslide itself was not fully recognized. The appeal changed that conclusion. In 1970, key officials were found guilty in connection with the landslide, flood, and deaths. The final Supreme Court judgment in 1971 recognized responsibility for an aggravated flood disaster whose predictability included the landslide and the resulting loss of life. The sentences were limited and reduced by amnesties and other legal provisions. For many families, the punishment felt painfully small beside 1,917 deaths. Civil claims and compensation disputes continued for decades. The legal archive eventually grew into hundreds of folders containing material dating from before the dam's construction through the final judgments. In 2023, the Criminal Proceedings Archive was added to UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. That recognition matters because Vajont is more than a historical tragedy. It is a record of how institutional failure develops. The danger was not hidden in one secret document. It was distributed across reports, departments, conversations, measurements, and decisions. One person saw the crack, another saw the instruments, another approved the filling, another received the warning, another believed the wave would remain within a calculated limit, another assumed someone else had authority to evacuate. The catastrophe emerged from the space between them. The survival of the Vajont Dam is not a strange accident. The arch was designed to carry water pressure into the strong rock of the gorge. The concrete wall was exceptionally well built. But the wave that overtopped it did not need to break the wall to destroy Longarone. This is why calling Vajont a dam collapse can be misleading. The dam did not fail structurally. The reservoir project failed as a complete system. Engineers focused enormous skill on the wall, while the unstable mountain became the true source of danger. The tragedy demonstrates a basic principle. Safety cannot be measured only by the strength of the most visible structure. A perfect component can exist inside a disastrous system. The concrete was strong. The geological understanding was incomplete. The warnings were fragmented. The model assumptions were too narrow. Communication failed. Evacuation failed. And confidence survived longer than the margin of safety. Today, the dam still stands in the gorge. Behind it, much of the reservoir is filled by the landslide. Visitors can look across the concrete crest and see the scar on Monte Toc. The scale remains difficult to absorb. The mountain appears close enough to touch. The surviving wall looks almost untouched. Below, Longarone has been rebuilt, but the new town cannot erase the absence beneath it. Names of the dead remain in memorials and cemeteries. The landscape itself has become evidence. Vajont is often described as a natural disaster. A mountain did fall, and gravity moved the water. But nature did not choose the reservoir level. Nature did not decide which reports to share. Nature did not decide to continue filling. Nature did not decide that uncertainty was acceptable. Nature did not fail to evacuate Longarone. The mountain created the hazard. Human decisions created the catastrophe. At 10:39 p.m. on October 9, 1963, Monte Toc entered the Vajont Reservoir. In roughly 20 seconds, the project's assumptions collapsed. The belief that the mountain would move slowly, the belief that lowering the water would remain effective, the belief that model tests had defined a safe level, the belief that the dam's strength protected the valley below. 4 minutes later, 1,917 people were dead. The dam survived. That is why the ruins of Vajont carry such a powerful warning. Disasters do not always begin when a structure breaks. Sometimes they begin when an institution keeps operating after the evidence has changed. Sometimes they begin when experts become accustomed to abnormal behavior, when every new crack is treated as another measurement, when every warning is answered with another study, when temporary control is mistaken for permanent safety, when responsibility is divided so widely that no one person stops the process. Vajont was not caused by ignorance alone. The people managing the reservoir possessed knowledge, instruments, models, and experience. They watched the mountain respond to the water. They knew that a huge mass could move. They knew a wave could form. What they did not accept in time was that the uncertainty itself had become intolerable. The final failure was not the concrete wall. It was the decision to keep gambling with the valley beneath it. Today, the dam remains almost exactly where it stood that night, a monument to brilliant engineering, a monument to catastrophic judgment, and above all, a monument to the people of Longarone, Erto, Casso, and the surrounding communities, whose lives were treated as part of an experiment that should have ended long before the mountain moved.